All right, let's start our conversation today. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's an honor for me to have Professor Alex. He's assistant professor at Jilin University. He's expert on Russian studies and especially Europe. And today, the topic of our discussion is Russia-Ukraine war and the West. And I would hand it over to Professor Alex and let him start his conversation on Russia-Ukraine war, and he would give us a brief perspective about the conflict and its history and how West look at it. Over to you, Professor Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Asif. Thank you very much, Professor Akhtar. Thank you to all who are joining us. Thanks for having me. It's a great honor. And yeah, the topic I was asked to present on is the Russia-Ukraine war and the West's perspective on that. And actually, I would like to make most of this session a Q&A to open it up to questions and the discussion. But before we do this, I would like to briefly give sort of an introductory talk. And when I say briefly, Asif knows that sometimes when I say briefly, that can become longer than intended. But I will be making a conscious effort to definitely keep it brief on this occasion. So the topic, as I said, Russia-Ukraine war and the West. Now that's already, kind of difficult in a way for me to take a position on because, the West, I mean, from an outside perspective, the West might look like a coherent whole, but I'm personally from Germany. I used to live in the UK for 10 years and obviously spent some time in other European countries and also in the US. Obviously, I also know the West can be very heterogeneous and very varied. And right now, ironically, I'm talking to you from China. So I'm thousands of kilometers away from the West, in a hotel room, as it were, so because I just arrived recently. So I hope the internet will be stable enough for this. But we shall make the best out of it. So, there's a lot to talk about, of course, when we talk about the Russia-Ukraine war and the West, but I just want to touch on a few very kind of what I consider to be some of the most important issues. And anything else we can then later, of course, discuss in the Q&A. And by the way, if at any point the audio cuts out or anything, please let me know. Then I will try to adjust that. So we are living in a world, we're kind of entering a period where it seems like armed conflicts and instability are becoming more common. And of course, in many parts of the world, they have been common throughout. But for most of the world, it's been a relatively peaceful time the last couple of decades. And that might not necessarily be a condition to last. And obviously, the Russia-Ukraine war has been kind of one of the biggest events in this regard. But then since that began, other things have happened. Obviously, probably the number one concern on people's minds in this regard today is actually the situation in Gaza since October last year. And that has meant that the Ukraine war has faded a bit into the background. But I think it shouldn't. Obviously, from a European perspective, this is very important. And from the perspective of the rest of the world, maybe not quite so. But I do think that objectively speaking, this is a very important and very crucial conflict. Obviously, from a European perspective, as I said, it's the first major war in Europe since World War II. So in about 80 years. There were minor wars in the former Yugoslavia, but nothing of this scale. But from a global perspective, what's more important is it is actually, even today, one of the most large-scale armed conflicts. So obviously, we don't know how the Gaza conflict is going to develop, but at the moment, in terms of the number of fatalities, injured and so on, this is the largest conflict ongoing in the world, the one in Ukraine. It's at the moment somewhat less intense than the one in Gaza, So that might change. But at the moment we can estimate, no one knows exactly, but we can estimate that there have already been probably around 200,000 up to maybe 300,000 deaths, fatalities, and countless injured. Of course, many of them civilians, the majority probably combatants so far. Why else is it important, though? Not just because of the sheer scale, but obviously it directly involves one of the world's great powers, Russia, which also is a nuclear armed power, and not just any nuclear armed power, but the one with the largest arsenal in the world. And on the other side, directly opposed, but indirectly, it involves the US, the EU states, other European states, NATO, or basically what you would, colloquially call the West, of course. The West is not directly involved in the fighting, but is very strongly indirectly involved. And as you might have heard recently, there's even been some debate about direct involvement in France, in the Baltics, in Poland. So we shall see. But that itself makes the conflict, of course, very high stakes. In addition, there's, of course, the nuclear dimension. Theoretically, at any point, this might escalate into nuclear confrontation as well. And again, one between the largest nuclear powers. There's not just Russia, but of course you have the US. On the Western side, you have not just the US, but also France and the UK, two other nuclear powers. Yeah, so the danger of escalation is very high, both on the conventional and the nuclear front. So this is, of course, a conflict that, even though it has receded a bit into the background recently, I guess from a global perspective, it is a really big deal, of course, particularly for Europe, but not just. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the reasons for the war. And I want to talk about this not so much because, in order to apportion blame, but talking about the reasons of the war is important for talking about how it might be resolved or how it might not be resolved, I think. Because in the end, of course, the war started, well, there's two possible dates when the war started, right? The most conventional one is February 24th, 2022, which was the date of the large-scale kind of three-pronged Russian invasion into Ukraine with about 200,000 forces from the north, east, and south simultaneously. But a lot of people would say the war started much earlier than that. A lot of people would say it started in 2014. In February 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. It was a relatively bloodless annexation, but it was a military conquest, effectively. It used its forces in sort of a lightning action to capture the peninsula and basically annex a large part of Ukraine. This already happened in February 2014. This is just a week after the events on the Maidan, the uprising against the Yanukovych government. And then a couple of months later, the conflict in eastern Ukraine started, where Russia claims it is not involved directly, but most people think it is, and there's a lot of evidence that it is. So there's been an ongoing, there's been the annexation of Crimea, and then for the last 8 years, up to the start of the invasion, the full-scale invasion, there's been an ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, albeit low-scale conflict, where Russia was almost certainly indirectly involved. So in that sense, the war has been going on for some time. But of course, in February 24th, it was massively escalated. And again, it's important to talk about why was it escalated? Why did Russia invade? In order to then later think about, how might that be stopped? What could be done in order to stop this war? Now, when you asked Putin, when you asked the Russian, but we should talk about Putin, because this was very much Putin's decision. Russia's political system now is such that he holds practically all the power. There's very few other centers of power left in Russia. So why did he decide to invade Ukraine? We don't know for sure, but basically 3 reasons have been given continuously. The first one is that there was a massive suffering of Russian-speaking civilians in eastern Ukraine and Donbass. Putin repeatedly called it a genocide. Okay, so he said that for 8 years there's been a genocide going on of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. That is a claim which, I don't want to evaluate it too much, but I think there's a lot of evidence pointing against this. I wanted to kind of actually, let me just quickly do that. Maybe there's a link here that I want to copy into the chat in case you're interested in this. This is actually a UN report about casualties in eastern Ukraine over the last couple of years. So basically, the UN Observer Force, which is present there, saying, hold on a second, let me just put this in the chat for everyone. So this is the link here. Environment. Yeah, okay, doesn't seem to work. Not sure what I'm doing wrong. Maybe I should do it afterwards. I'll give it one more try just now. But basically, so there were UN observers in eastern Ukraine all these years, and they've been filing regular reports about civilian casualties. So they said in this report, if you're interested, okay, we'll post that later. I'm not sure what's happening right now. But they basically said that the number of people who died, the number of civilians who've been dying in eastern Ukraine was about like a dozen people a year. So Putin said there were 14,000 casualties, 14,000 dead civilians. The UN said, no, actually, there were probably about 1,000 or so in the first year, like in 2015. And then afterwards, it was normally like 1 or 2 dozen a year, many of which on the side of the Ukrainians, and most of them just dying from unexploded ordnance, unexploded mines, and so on. So there's no evidence whatsoever that this claim by Putin holds any truth about a genocide or anything of this kind. The other 2 claims I think are more important. Now, the first of those is geopolitical. Yeah. So that's the argument that what Russia did was ultimately due to NATO expansion and sort of Western pressure. That Russia has its sphere of influence, of which Ukraine is traditionally a part, and that the West has sort of been relentlessly pushing more and more into that, with the expansion of NATO in particular. That is an argument which certainly has to be taken seriously. And again, whether it's right or wrong, I'm not going to, try to assess that. I personally would say it has some merit. I would like to maybe present a few points, however, of why I think it only has limited merit. Again, but I'm not saying that this is wrong. But some reasons why I'm not particularly convinced by this account that this is the crucial reason is that I don't think there was really any form of imminent threat to Russia. I mean, Putin has talked about it in very dramatic terms. He said that Russia is on the verge of destruction. The West is trying to dismantle it. If Ukraine was to join NATO, it would be the end of Russia. The thing is, though, that I think there was no actual cause to believe that Ukraine would join NATO anytime soon. I mean, Ukraine clearly wanted to. It put that into its own constitution, I think in 2021 or so. But there wasn't really much appetite in the West. There was appetite among some states, like the Baltic states and Poland. But in the end, such a decision has to be made unanimously. And the important thing is a lot of people who kind of use this argument of NATO expansion, they forget that in 2022, in 2021, 2022, there was really no scenario under which Ukraine would soon be joining NATO. It wasn't even on the agenda. Back in 2008, there had been a very vague promise given that one day Ukraine would join NATO, and that's it. And as for this argument that NATO has been continuously expanding towards Russia, well, it's worth looking at this map down here. This is sort of the different expansions of NATO. Obviously, the most recent ones are Sweden and Finland. Those 2 countries actually joined because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I wrote a think tank piece back in January 2022, which was published in early February 2022, a couple of weeks before the invasion, where I was saying, look, it makes no sense from a geopolitical perspective for Russia to invade Ukraine. I thought they would probably invade Ukraine, but not for geopolitical reasons, because if they do, Finland and Sweden would almost certainly join NATO, and that's what they did. So this is the reason. But it's interesting, before that, if you look at the expansion of NATO, last time NATO actually expanded towards the border of Russia was 20 years ago, in 2004. So in 1999, there was Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and then in 2004, Slovakia, the Baltic states. That was, it was a move that might have been a mistake from a geopolitical perspective. But again, that was 20 years ago, or 18 years before the invasion. Since then, there's just been some tiny states in the Balkans that have joined, very far away from Russia's borders. And as I said, there was no real prospect of Ukraine joining, which would have required unanimity. I mean, you might have seen how difficult it was for Sweden to join, which was a much less controversial country, and even after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, so that's why this whole, claim that there's an imminent threat from Ukraine towards Russia, from a geopolitical perspective, I don't know. To me, it doesn't sound very convincing that this was really the one and only, or the crucial motivation for Putin. But I'm not saying that this argument would be wrong. There's a debate about this. And in the end, there's only one person in the world who really knows that, presumably, which is Putin himself. What I think is important is to look at the third motivation there as well. That's one which is often overlooked. And that's that this is, I think, not just about geopolitics, but one important factor here, and again, it's hard to say how important, but one important factor is nationalism. I think that there's a very strong belief among the Russian elites, especially with Putin himself, that Ukraine is a part of Russia historically, that Ukrainians are Russians, that the nation of Ukraine doesn't exist, that Ukraine as a state is an accident of history that shouldn't exist, that there is no Ukraine. And that, beyond all geopolitics and everything else, that I believe was one of the important reasons why Putin ultimately decided to invade. That he wanted to make sure that Ukraine stays within the Russian fold, either as a satellite state or as a part of Russia, because he thinks this is part of the Russian nation, because it's a nationalist motivation underlying this. That's what I think. Personally, I think that's a very important factor. Others might disagree, and I'm not saying they're wrong. But, that's something that I've written about also in the past. Already in 2020, I wrote a blog piece for LSE where I was outlining how important I thought this is for Russians, and for Putin in particular, this idea that, Ukraine should be part of Russia, and that this should be part of the historic Russia. And also, however, trying to outline why I think that's historically wrong. And I wrote a more recent article last year for the LSE Public Policy Review, which is also linked here. I somehow can't share the links at the moment, where I'm making this again. So if you're interested in this argument, I would recommend to have a look at that. But I do think this is very important. I mean, obviously, you might all have heard about this recent interview by...
Sorry. I shared some of the links you shared with me. I shared with my PhD students, and later on I will share it with all my students. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you. No worries. Thank you, Asif. Thanks a lot. So yeah, the links are there if you're interested. So you might have heard about this recent interview by Tucker Carlson with Putin. And, what's interesting about that is obviously, basically 2 hours of Putin presenting his own view unilaterally there pretty much. But what was interesting is that, Tucker Carlson is someone who himself believes the West should not support Ukraine. He said this very clearly. And it was interesting, I think, in this interview was that he was really trying to get this statement out of Putin that it is all NATO's fault and all the West's fault. But what Putin did instead is for the first 20 to 30 minutes, he talked about history, trying to say, why Ukraine is not a state, and why, Ukrainians are Russians, and why apparently Hitler was justified to attack Poland, but that's a different story. Again, it's really, I think we shouldn't, the geopolitical argument with NATO expansion, very important. I don't want to discount it, but we shouldn't discount also the sort of nationalist / neo-imperialist motivation that seems to underlie a lot of this. And if you're not convinced, just read the speeches. Read the speeches. Putin talks about it all the time. And if you're really not convinced, read other people's speeches. Dmitry Medvedev, former president and former prime minister, currently deputy head of the Security Council in Russia. Every week, he's publishing remarkable statements about basically saying kind of, yeah, Ukraine doesn't exist, it shouldn't be there. Well, we're going to get Kiev, we're going to get Odessa, we're going to get Kharkiv, we're going to get all of Ukraine, it will all be part of Russia, it will be the new province of Novorossiya or Malorossiya, which is the historic term during the Russian Empire that was used for Ukraine, Little Russia. So again, it's all there for those who want to see the kind of nationalist element. It's pretty much in plain view right there. Anyway, so why did I talk about this? Because I think it's important. What Putin's motivation is important for trying to think about what might he be willing to do to bring this war to an end. What would he be satisfied with? Because obviously those people who think it was all geopolitical and about NATO expansion, they tend to believe all we need to do is make Ukraine a neutral state, settle it forever, that it's not going to join NATO or anything, and then we can end this war. And it's just kind of, in a sense, the fault of the West that they're pushing too much for Ukraine to kind of continue fighting. And I think the problem with this belief is that would assume it's all about geopolitics. But as I said, I think very likely that's not all. I think very likely there are other reasons why Putin wants parts of Ukraine, or maybe all of Ukraine, certainly places I think like Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa, which are not yet under Russian control, and why it might be very difficult to bring this, more difficult to bring this war to an end than many people think. But we don't know. None of this is certain, of course. Now, this is the final slide. This is, since the topic is Russia-Ukraine war in the West, the question then is, what are the West's potential choices here? First of all, the question I raised, I think, at the beginning, what is the West, actually? Initially, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was great unity among the states that are commonly labeled the West. But what we can also see now is that this unity is definitely fraying. There are different states have different priorities at this point, and more so than there being a disunity between states, there is the factor that the Ukraine war, I think, has become more and more of a partisan political issue. That means, to put it very simplistically, in most states in the West, the left of the political spectrum has tended to become more supportive of Ukraine over time, and the right has tended to become less supportive of Ukraine over time. And the people who are most opposed to supporting Ukraine, continuing to support Ukraine at this point, within most states of the Western world, are the far right. And of course, in the US, these people, for example, are represented by Donald Trump and the Republicans, and that has already led to the US effectively stopping its military support for Ukraine. I'm not sure how much exactly is still flowing from the US to Ukraine, but it is much less than it used to be, and just a trickle, because it's been embroiled in this political dispute. With this, Ukraine has lost has lost its most important backer effectively for the time being, and might have lost it permanently, depending on whether Trump wins the election. So we got this. And there's similar issues in most Western states as well. You look at Germany, France, and others. Generally, the far right tends to be opposed to help for Ukraine. Most of the rest of the political spectrum is in favor. So this disunity of the West depends more in terms of who's in power in which state, actually, at the moment, rather than it being strictly, that certain countries are in favor and certain are not, with some exceptions. Hungary has been very continuously opposed to aiding Ukraine, with the far right leader on top. But generally, it's turned into a partisan political issue, like most things in the West, of course, do sooner or later. So what are the options here? If we still kind of pretend that the West is some kind of unified entity here, what are the options here? Well, the first question would be, what if support is dropped, actually? What if the West suddenly dropped support from one day to the other, military support in particular? what would happen then? Okay, some people believe that then, the war would end. There would be a force towards negotiations. The Ukrainians would be forced to negotiate. Putin would make some kind of reasonable demands, and then the war could be ended. Well, that's, however, I think an overly optimistic scenario. The first question, of course, if the West dropped its support for Ukraine, would be, what would the Ukrainians do? Maybe they would surrender. Maybe they would simply just collapse militarily. So far there's been very little movement on the battlefield for the last kind of year, or even more, if you will. But there's been slow momentum being gained by Russia, because Ukraine is currently running out of ammunition. So maybe they would collapse, and Russia would just roll over them. But more likely, they would continue to put up stiff resistance, which means the war would slowly shift away from the trenches and towards the major cities. Ironically, because of the weapons that have been provided, there's been a relative stalemate so far, which means that for the last year and a half, it's been mainly a fight in the trenches with occasional light bombardments of the cities. But if this shifts and the fighting gets closer to the major cities again, we would probably see massive human casualties. Basically, the scenario we've seen in the city of Mariupol at the beginning of the war, which was encircled, had a population pre-war of more than 500,000 people. In that city alone, tens of thousands of civilians have likely died, and the city was almost completely destroyed. And it's likely we will see this with other cities in Ukraine if the Ukrainian army falls back, rather than Ukraine just capitulating. No one knows for sure, but yeah. So I think it would be very optimistic to think that if Ukraine didn't have the strength to fight anymore, the war would simply end. I think it would become a retreating war. It would become maybe more of a partisan war. I think it would become likely very nasty indeed. So that's one risk. The other risk of not supporting Ukraine is that, if Russia would seize most or much of Ukraine, it's likely there would be other casualties along the line. So just to see here, if you look at the battlefield map here at the bottom, the red area is the one that's currently occupied by Russia. The bluish area is the one that Russia used to be in but retreated in 2022. And then the yellow is what's still under control by the Ukrainians. And we can see the bottom left near Ukraine, there's another country, a small country called Moldavia. So that's a country which would quite likely be next online for a Russian intervention, because it already has a separatist area. You might see it as a small area in the east of Moldova, which is a different color. That's an area which is already currently under occupation by Russian troops. It has been since the early 1990s against the will of the Moldovan government. It's an area called Transnistria. And of course, that's a tactic we've seen Russia use time and again. We've seen it used in Georgia, we've seen it used in Ukraine, and also here. You occupy a small part of the country with so-called peacekeepers. You kind of hand out passports to the population, and then the population supposedly asked to join Russia, and next is a military intervention, and the whole country kind of is destabilized and goes. And the same scenario would likely happen in Moldova. Just weeks ago, Transnistria, this breakaway region, officially asked, I think, or there was sort of official appeal to join Russia. So if Russian forces in the south break towards the west, they would seize the city of Odessa, one of the biggest in Ukraine. They would seize the Black Sea coast, and then likely it wouldn't just be Ukraine. And they would have a land bridge to Transnistria. Moldova, which is bordering Romania, an EU country, would probably next fall. It's also a former Soviet republic, so Russia also traditionally sees it as part of its sphere of influence. It has already said that, that has already there's a lot of statements coming out of the Kremlin already suggesting that Moldova would be next. There's other former Soviet republics that are would likely be casualties as well, Georgia, Armenia. But maybe not just that. There's also a very real and strong fear in Europe that Russia would be inclined to attack members of the EU and also members of NATO. particularly the Baltic states, which also used to be part of the Soviet Union, possibly Poland. And again, if you look at statements coming out of Moscow by senior officials, they constantly basically threaten that in one way or another. They basically constantly say that this is historically Russia. This should be, they shouldn't have gotten independence in the first place, or they're mistreating our citizens and this and that. So there's a very real fear here that if Ukraine falls, other states could be next, possibly even members of NATO. Now, normally there's an assumption that Putin would not attack NATO states, but at the same time, what is the future of NATO going to be? The statements coming out of the Trump camp in the US suggest that maybe the US would abandon NATO if Trump becomes president again. And a lot of Republicans are certainly kind of pushing in that direction. So if that happens, what would happen to these other states, which are actually EU states, which are kind of core European states? And there's one other issue which Western countries are concerned about, and that is the precedent that is being set by Russia here. So Russia has launched an objectively unprovoked invasion of a sovereign state. An unprovoked invasion meaning, Ukraine wasn't posing any evident threat to Russia. There was no imminent attack or anything else. It was, from the Russian perspective, a preemptive war, but effectively it was an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign state. Now, obviously the West collectively is not in a perfect position to criticize this, arguably, because there have been cases like this where the West has done that. The US in particular has done that with its allies. Just think about Iraq. Iraq is the most obvious case, which was a clear violation of state sovereignty when it happened. I mean, other cases are more debatable, but the Iraq case in particular, and I say this as someone who, when I was a student, I was, protesting in London against the war in Iraq. But evidently, for the West to just talk about sovereignty here would seem, I think it's justified in many ways, but of course I can't blame other countries who would say that this is hypocritical. But there's one thing to consider. What Russia has done in Ukraine, I think, is a different type of sovereignty violation. Because, US violated the sovereignty of Iraq and of other countries, and I guess some people would claim also of Pakistan at various occasions. But Russia's done something more. I mean, because the US has invaded, temporarily occupied these states, but Russia has actually not just invaded and temporarily occupied Ukraine, it has seized its territory and formally annexed it to Russia. The Russian constitution has been rewritten to make these territories part of Russia. Wrong way. Again, those territories which are now red have been officially declared eternal parts of Russia now, plus more. It gets important. There's some territories that are currently still occupied by Ukraine, which Russia is also claiming. So what we're dealing with here is not just an invasion and a temporary occupation. We're dealing with military conquest. A military conquest and annexation of parts of another state. And that's kind of without precedent in recent history. I can't think of another case where a great power for the last 50 or more years has actually used its military force to annex territories from another state and make them permanently part of their own territory. It's a war of military conquest. And I think that's very important because I think this sets a new precedent. There's not just the Iraq precedent, that's more, which will be watched closely by other states that might have similar inclinations. And in fact, I think we've already seen, certain stirrings. We look at Venezuela now claiming parts of its neighbors in Guyana. You see, Azerbaijan claiming parts of Armenia and so on. And, where is this, if this remains unopposed, then where is this going to go? In fact, that's, I think, a big question, particularly for the states of the global south, or especially smaller states. What kind of precedent does that set? And by the way, we're also not, we're not sure how much Russia ultimately wants. I don't think they only want the parts they've annexed so far. As I said before, I mean, Putin has said very clearly, he's talked a lot about Kiev, he's talked a lot about Kharkiv, which is in the north. mostly Russian-speaking. You talked about Odessa. I think what Russia really wants, if it can get its hands on this, at least Putin, would be large parts of Ukraine and maybe all of it, to make this part of Russia, to annex it into Russia. Possibly to the point where the entire state of Ukraine will disappear. We don't know, because so far he has not been able to realize this, but it's quite likely that if he's able to do it, he will. I will say one more thing, what I find interesting. Even those people who think it's all about geopolitics, it's all about NATO expansion, and Putin is just afraid of that. What Putin has talked about a lot are the territories in the north of Ukraine, because they're closest to Moscow. He says, oh, they could be in missile range of Moscow. What's interesting is those are not even occupied by Russia yet. So even if we have this geopolitical belief that it's all just about, Russia feeling unsafe, it's very unlikely that Putin would just accept the territories occupied so far, because the territories in the north of Russia, like Kharkiv, Sumy, and so on, Chernivtsi, they are Chernihiv, sorry. They are territories which are, of course, closest to Moscow, strategically speaking. So even from a purely geopolitical perspective, it's likely that Russia would want to control those. So, for those who think that, if Ukraine just capitulates, then, they can keep the rest of Ukraine, all will be fine. I think that's a very kind of optimistic belief, because I think there's many, many reasons for Russia to keep pressing on as long as it can, as long as no one stops it. Those are some thoughts about this. Obviously, another reason why I think Kiev doesn't want to negotiate, in spite of all the pressure that's on it militarily, is that they would think that if we kind of freeze the war now, if Russia gets those territories that it already controls and they officially become part of Russia, it just prepares the stage for the next war. Because obviously, when Russia gained Crimea in 2014 and Eastern Ukraine and Donbass, that made it militarily much easier to attack Ukraine. So as you can see, the biggest success Russia has had militarily was in the south, actually. And a lot of this depended on having Crimea. If Russia hadn't controlled Crimea in February 2022, its assault would probably have been much less successful. It's possible that it would have been stopped much more effectively by the Ukrainian military. But because it had Crimea, it could launch a three-way assault on Ukraine. So obviously, if it gets more territories now, a lot of Ukrainians, I think, believe that Russia then just has another couple of 100 kilometers advantage, and Ukraine has lost even more of its strategic depth, and there will be future assault by Russia sooner or later, inevitably, and then it would be much harder to defend against it. So those are some of the arguments that are bandied around for continuing to support Ukraine, even militarily. So what's the West going to do? I think it's not so much a question as, will the West just stop supporting Ukraine or will it not? The question is how much it will support Ukraine. As I say, the US has already pretty much frozen its support due to Republican pressure. That leaves it to the Europeans. And among the Europeans, there's some who want to give a lot of support and others who want to give practically no support. And you have a lot of states in between. It depends a lot on the political position of the governments, etc. So there will be continued support. The question is how much. Now, purely in economic terms, the West could provide much more than it currently does. I just have this little graph at the bottom right corner. Just as a reminder, so these are the largest economies in the world by nominal GDP, the top 10. Russia isn't even on there, it's number 11. So all the other 10 are actually bigger than Russia in terms of nominal GDP and sort of industrial output, or not industrial output necessarily, but economic output. And with the exception of China, India, and Brazil, all of these states are part of the West, and there's others too. So theoretically, if the West got together and really tried to pool its economic resources, then it could outspend Russia many times over. But it's unlikely that it will do anything even close to that, and there's different reasons for that. And at the moment, they're struggling in particular to get ammunition production going, which they could have done a long time ago, but they kind of slept on it. So anyway, so this is a basic situation, I would say. And under those circumstances, what's going to happen? And with this limited support that Ukraine is getting, can Ukraine prevail against Russia? I think it's likely that after the quote-unquote elections in Russia, which are already foregone conclusion, of course, that Putin is going to win. I think after this, it's possible that Putin will announce a new mass mobilization, which currently would seem unpopular at the moment, but we'll see. Certainly, the pressure on Ukraine will rise. Maybe it will not be able to continue resisting. Likely, it will be able to continue resisting, but will be slowly pushed back. And then, of course, the question arises of negotiations. The Ukrainian government has so far categorically denied having or rejected negotiations with Russia. I personally don't necessarily think that's a very smart idea. I think having some form of negotiation going on would be good, but under the premise that Russia will probably not be negotiating in good faith. But anyway, this is just my personal view. And of course, this is more about, what's the Western perspective on this? So as I said, very difficult to do. The West is very heterogeneous, made up of many different actors with different interests. But I hope that I've kind of elucidated this perspective a little bit by doing this. Oh, so this was, I was aiming for 15 minutes. Instead, I've been talking for 45. It's
It's
to
all
be
right.
expected, as Asif knows. But
It's
yeah, let me
completely
stop right here,
Yep.
and then we
Thanks
can
so
move
much. It
on
was
to the
fascinating.
Q&A.
It was fascinating, and you elaborated it very well. You explained the Western perspective and the nature of the conflict and where it's heading. We have raise of hands here, so I would ask Dr. Rabia, please, if you would want to add something here.
Thanks. Ali's hand was up first, but
Boss is always first.
Okay, all right, yeah. So thank you so much for this very enlightening talk. I'm just, wanted to get your perspective on, so, Crimea happened in 2014, and then Ukraine happened in 2022, right? And in between, you have all these years. Was it Western intelligence failure for not joining the dots as to what Russia's next move would be? Because it's really easy to, put the blame on Putin and talk about, all the big factors that you have touched upon. But where does the blame lie with respect to the West, the collective West, not having foresight of what was going to happen next? Just that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, once again, I think the Western perspective here has varied quite a bit. So there have been many voices that have been warning all along, from beginning to end, that eventually there will be a major Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, from 2021, these voices became much louder because then Russia started amassing troops. It actually did this in early 2021, then it withdrew them. But then in late 2021, it started amassing troops again. And obviously, up to that point, there've been various voices, particularly in the Baltic states and Poland and elsewhere, who basically said sooner or later Russia is going to attack. But the more this became visible, the louder these voices became. But at the same time, there were various voices that adamantly refused this possibility. And if, for example, to give you one example, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, I think he, if I recall correctly, sort of not long after the invasion, I think he basically fired the head of his intelligence service, because until the day of the invasion, that apparently his own intelligence service had apparently kind of tried to convince him that it's not going to happen. And then there were very senior people in Germany, for example, which I'm more familiar with, that made the same claims. At the same time, as you may know, the US and UK intelligence services in the months leading up to the war, they were pretty spot on. They made a lot of it was very unusual, actually. They became very public. They went unusually public with their warnings that there would be an invasion, even with very detailed warnings where Russia would attack, when it would attack. And most of it was very accurate, as we now know. But obviously, this was intelligence that came together in this form only in the last couple of months before the invasion. We don't know exactly when Putin made this decision to invade. I mean, he, well, again, to have a full-scale invasion. The invasion effectively began in many ways in 2014. But this full-scale open invasion that began in February 2022. We don't know exactly when Putin made up his mind about it, probably already in early 2021, if not earlier, but it's hard to say. And that's what makes it so hard. In Russia is a very opaque system. And how many people even knew about this decision on the Russian side is very hard to say. There's a lot of evidence that even a lot of Putin's cabinet members, even people within the government at high posts outside the security mechanism didn't know this until the day it happened. Junior commanders in the military probably only found out about it a few days before. The individual soldiers, the ordinary soldiers, didn't actually know until they'd set foot into Ukraine that this was not an exercise. So yeah, there was very high secrecy surrounding it. But yeah, in the end, it was the question of how much, kind of very much of what perspective people had. Now, the question is, what could the West have done to prevent this? In a sense, of course, there are two schools here, right? The one would have said, be more more appeasing, if you will, more compromising towards Russia. And the other side, actually, no, actually more deterrence would have been better, that there was not enough deterrence. And in the end, yeah, I mean, who knows which of those is actually correct. But I think, in terms of being compromising, I think there were a lot of compromises being made. And that's also, as I said, why, for example, the whole idea of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon was, I think, very far-fetched. If you looked at the positions that many NATO states, key NATO states like Germany, France, and others held, it was very unlikely that this is going to happen anytime within the next few decades even. And there was a lot of compromising happening at the time. Of course, was it enough? This is, of course, when it comes to conflict, preventing conflict, there's always this dynamic between compromise and deterrence. And the problem is, if you have just the middle between the two, it might be just the worst place of all, right? Either you have enough deterrence or you have enough compromise in a sense. Yeah, and I think the jury is out on this, will be for a long time. It's possible that there would have been no way to prevent this, depending on how strong Putin's motivation was. It's possible that maybe the West, if that compromised more, could have achieved more. Maybe if it had sent a clear message. I'll give you one example, which I think was a very good example of really bad deterrence, which is Germany. Of course, this issue about Nord Stream 2, which was a big gas pipeline which had been newly built from Russia to support Germany. It was actually been inaugurated in 2015, already after Russia had annexed Crimea and effectively intervened in eastern Ukraine. Nonetheless, Germany continued what could be called an appeasement course towards Russia. It inaugurated the pipeline. The pipeline was built. I was basically ready around the time when the war started. And just before the war started, in the weeks before, when people were becoming more and more anxious about an outbreak of conflict, there was a lot of pressure on the German government to say clearly, if this war happens, we will abandon Nord Stream 2. But they refused. The German Chancellor Scholz refused to clearly state that. Until the day of the attack, he refused to say, no, Nord Stream 2 won't happen if Russia attacks Ukraine. But then Russia did attack Ukraine. And then a few days later, he said, now Nord Stream 2 won't happen. And that's just, kind of the worst possible way to do it. I mean, I don't think that declaring that Nord Stream 2 wouldn't happen would have stopped Russia's invasion, obviously, but it can be part of this deterrence showing that there will be consequences. But if you then decide to wait until after the fact to make such an announcement, it showed how reluctant a lot of Western states were to really face Russia head on, actually, at that time, I think.
Thank you so much. I have a question that I just want to add it with it. Then I would ask Ali Jafri to ask his question. I just want to add that you mentioned about Russia's invasion into Ukraine. But if you look at the invasion was with minimal, not the full-fledged force of Russian forces to invade Ukraine, 150,000 soldiers. So do you think there was an intent to conquer Ukraine with this much of a force, which is highly unlikely? Or was it just a strategic operation or a strategic op that they were opted to? May I ask the second question from Ali Jafri? Can we take it out also here?
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah, all right, Ali.
Thank you, Dr. Asif. Thank you so much for delivering a very wide-ranging talk, which covered all the bases. My question pertains to the battlefield dynamic that's currently at play. We do understand that the Russian military has some structural weaknesses, but we have also seen that after the initial 2 months of the war, the Russians have developed a system of replenishments, which has not been the case for Ukraine. And we are at a point where Ukraine, no matter how weak the Russian military could be structurally, cannot sustain itself and cannot hold positions if it does not get urgent military aid from the West, especially the US. So with the elections coming up, and you rightly said they're a foregone conclusion, how do you look at this gap in the militaries with regard to sustenance as a factor in the future operations in the war? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Both excellent questions. So yeah, let me respond to you first, Asif. The question you asked there, very good, very important question, and it's one that I've thought about myself, because that's a point that was that has been raised by various critics of Western military aid to Ukraine and others. And one person who has raised this, for example, was John Mearsheimer in various contributions. And of course, he is, as you may know, he's been from the start kind of one of those people saying this is about geopolitics and it's kind of, NATO's responsibility. And one of the things he said was, yeah, this is, okay, Russia, this was a small force that was attacking, and this wasn't really seriously an attempt to take up, to take over all of Ukraine. So I've thought about this, and obviously we don't know. Once again, this is in Putin's head, and it's not even in Russia. Even if we saw the archives of the government and so on, we probably would see very little of help, because it was really it seems like a very small group of people who really made this decision in the end within the Security Council context, the presidential administration. So this is kind of informed speculation. But I don't subscribe to that belief that this was just kind of like a strategic maneuver or something. And first of all, the force was substantial. I mean, we're talking more between 150 and 200,000 troops. So it was a very large number of forces. Putin had the president of Crimea, wherewith at a sweep of hand within a relatively small force, he managed to just take over the peninsula. And there's been various kind of information emerging in the first couple of months of the war that suggest Putin probably thought Ukraine would just fall together like a house of cards. We now, there's some evidence that the Russian intelligence service, before the war conducted some secret polls in southern Ukraine and elsewhere that suggested that there was very little confidence by Ukrainians in their government. There was also, it's very likely that Putin was informed by certain forces. For example, there was a person called Medvedchuk, who was a long-term pro-Russian force in Ukrainian politics, who was very close to Putin. Putin is actually the godfather of his child, and who and others who very likely would have tried to convince Putin that, you know, many Ukrainians are just waiting kind of to be kind of quote unquote liberated by Russia. Shortly after the invasion began, Putin appealed to the Ukrainian forces to capitulate. He said, and you know, the force that came in there was substantial. I mean, there were tens of thousands of troops advancing rapidly towards Kyiv. And to some extent, I think it was a matter of luck and of coincidence that it wasn't like, for example, at I think it was Boryspil airport near Kiev, there was a very important battle happened. There were Russian paratroopers who were setting up sort of an airfield for massive resupply from within Russia, and they were defeated in a very close battle, which basically made this plan impossible. Another case, the Ukrainians at one point flooded an area to stop the Russian advance. And of course, there was also in the early weeks, there was a very surprising deficits on the Russian side. Like, for example, you had this 40-kilometer long convoy of armed Russian vehicles that was trying to push into Kiev, but they were basically stalled because their equipment was so bad and because weakened by sort of years of corruption and bad maintenance and so on. So the forces were there to decapitate, to sort of take Kiev in this kind of lightning advance, as well as other neuralgic points. And they were successful in the south, even with this limited force. They were very successful initially. And a lot of defenses there collapsed. So, you know, that doesn't look to me like it wasn't a series. I think I think Putin was just counting on the surprise effect. He was, I think, overestimating the state of his own forces, and I think he was underestimating the willingness of Ukrainians to fight back, because he was informed by people who kind of tried to convince him that Ukraine was there for the taking. That's my impression. But also, you know, for those people who do think it was just like a tactical advance, you know, what I would challenge them to do is, okay, what was the point? You sent like up to 200,000 forces from 3 sides into Ukraine, including clearly trying to capture Kiev, to do what exactly? You know, I mean, then what? I mean, it's still hundreds of thousands. You know, these are multiple divisions. This is an entire army. There's more forces involved than in many wars historically. To do what? What is this tactical maneuver? I mean, if you'd want to make a tactical maneuver, I guess you would have maybe advanced in one place on the periphery, just to show the world, oh, look, we can take more territory whenever we want, instead of having this, you know, 3-pronged major assault. And I think the reason he was using like 150, 200,000 troops instead of 1 million was simply because he really, 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 really wanted to keep it secret. I think he really wanted the element of surprise. That's why, as I said, he kept it secret even from his own commanders until the last few days, from his soldiers until it happened, from his own cabinet until it happened. And of course, if you had, instead of, you know, when you have 150,000, 200,000 troops, you can still say, oh, they're just having exercises, you know. When you have 1 million troops, you can no longer make that claim. So, and a lot of people were buying that claim still at the time, even in Ukraine. I think a lot of people were not believing Russia would invade. So, I don't know. To me, this seems like from the beginning, again, I don't know if Putin wanted to make all of Ukraine part of Russia or something like this, but I do think that he wanted to make sure that Russia controls Ukraine, you know, one way or the other, by putting up, you know, a Russian-controlled government, or by, you know, occupying the whole place. And maybe, I'm not sure about Western Ukraine, but I think certainly Kiev and everything to the east and south. That's my impression. And I don't think that this argument that this was just a kind of a strategic or tactical advance, that really makes sense, because I'm not sure how, from a military perspective, that how was it supposed to play out then. So especially with a three-pronged assault. At some point, those three forces would have had to meet. Otherwise, they would have been isolated and cut off. So that's why, yeah, even though some big names have put this forward, I personally am certainly doubtful with regard to this. But again, that's just my personal opinion. About the second question, the problem is with detaching the questions that I already forgot some of the details, but basically it's about the battlefield dynamic.
And it was about the military aid, that is, the Russians can replenish their military support, and but on the other hand, Ukraine is unable to, because it is heavily dependent on the Western support and the equipment from the US. And elections are coming, and there might be Trump in power. So how do you see that?
Yeah, so basically the US has been by far the biggest supporter of Ukraine so far. And to some extent, the European states have also kind of been leaning back a bit, and letting Washington take care of a lot of things. And now suddenly, quite suddenly, this support has dried up, because it's not just that, in November of this year, Donald Trump might be reelected. It's also that even now, he's already got such a hold on the Republican Party that de facto, even though there's some Republican support for continuing military aid to Ukraine for tactical political reasons, effectively the Republicans have now completely blocked it. So at the moment, the support from military support from the US has dried up. And yeah, that puts Europe on the spot. And Europe has already provided a lot of support. And it could, to be honest, Europe could provide far more. It has the economic capacity, it has the industrial capacity, it has major arms industries. A lot of European states are among the biggest military exporters in the world. The problem is that they've done too little too late. Like, for example, with ammunition, does Europe have the capacity to compete with Russia in terms of ammunition production? Absolutely. It has Europe combined has a much bigger industrial capacity than Russia, even in the military sector. However, it takes time. And just now, for example, I think a month or two ago, Germany inaugurated a new munitions factory. Well, that's going to be starting its mass production, I think, in 2 years. Well, great. Still, so by that time, it'll probably be too late for Ukraine. So it is a difficult situation now, and there are very vocal debates in Europe right now about this, what to do, to what extent. But there's certainly more that Europe can do. The problem is, how united is it going to be? How much political consensus is there going to be for that? Right now, for example, there's an initiative. The Czech Republic said that they've actually identified a lot of ammunition floating around the world from different sources. And if the Europeans would get together, then we can just purchase this and give it to Ukraine. And then for now, the whole would be plugged for some time. But then other states have said, no, but we'd rather spend our money on our own production. But that, of course, is too slow. And it's the usual stuff you have in Europe. There's sort of endless debates. There usually is some outcome, but the problem is it's slow. And that's the time that Ukraine possibly doesn't have. So it also depends a lot on what's happening in Ukraine and with the Ukrainians. The Russians are currently pushing forward. They're slowly advancing, mainly because Ukraine is short on ammunition. They're also short on men. That's something that Europe can't help with.
They're outnumbered with 1 to 8 guns on the battlefield, even.
Yeah, I don't know the exact figures, but of course the thing is, Ukraine could also. I mean, Ukraine still has potential to mobilize more people. The question is how determined those are going to be. That's something for more military analysts to determine. As far as Europe is concerned, yeah, a lot more could be done, and I think it's dawning on people in Europe. But as I said, it might be too slow. It depends on whether Ukraine can slow the Russian advance until the Europeans have gotten their act together, or whether at some point they might just be overwhelmed and there might be a relatively quick Russian advance. That's something which is only going to become clear in the coming weeks and months. But certainly it is very, very high at the moment on the European agenda. For a long time, they kind of leaned a bit too much on the Americans. At the moment, this is really a very strong topic of debate. One thing we also have to consider, there's also an election coming up in Europe. It's the European Parliament elections. It's not the most important election in the world, even within the European context, but it is also something where these kind of things are going to play a role. I think that's it's a couple of months' time. Yeah.
We have our postgraduate students. I see a hand raised there. Over to you, Varis, please let them ask a question.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Asif. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
You want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Alexander, for your valuable insights. Upon the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, we saw the West and particularly the US try to rally a lot of support from the international community to condemn Russia. Just recently, we saw the US veto a resolution in UNSC calling for ceasefire in Israel. And so how do you see that, even presuming that there is a pro-Ukraine government in the West, and if Russia chooses to advance even further into the EU states, as you hinted at earlier, let's say even Austria for that matter, how do you see the West trying to seek support from the international community in condemning Russia in that case?
All right, thank you very much.
Can we take another question with this?
Let me, I think it's best if I answer them one by one, otherwise
yeah, one by one would be.
Sorry. But we'll get back to you after that. Yeah, first of all, when Russia, when the full-scale invasion happened in February 2022, the West and also Ukraine presumably was probably a bit over-optimistic about what the reaction from the rest of the world would be. So clearly there has been disappointment in the West about the reaction in many parts of the world, which has been, well, a mixture of, some condemnation, but not necessarily very strong, without normally much, for example, in terms of economic consequences either. A mixture of that mixed with indifference in many other parts of the world, and mixed with a certain degree certainly of support for Russia among some states and perhaps among various publics more so than their governments. So that's certainly something that has happened, and it's probably fair to say that the West has been a bit surprised and disappointed about the degree of about the type of reaction there's been in large parts of the world, which maybe it shouldn't have been. Again, maybe it was also overestimating its own sway in other parts of the world, and also the degree of resentment against the West collectively, or parts of the West in this regard. But here we are. That certainly seems to be the situation. That's also important, not just symbolically and diplomatically, but also one of the effects of this has been that one thing that hasn't succeeded from Western perspective very much are the sanctions measures against Russia. They have had an effect, but they have not had as strong an effect long-term on Russia's economy as Western states had hoped. And one important reason is that the gaps were kind of filled by other parts of the world. In fact, other parts of the world, that includes China, that includes India, that includes the Gulf states and others, they have in many ways filled those gaps for Russia, and certainly not supported the West. Of course, when we talk about the West, some states that have supported the Western position, there are states like Japan, Korea, which are alliance links to the US, even though they're not traditionally part of the West. But yeah, in large parts of the world, the reaction was very different. So that's an important development in many ways. It's also raises, of course, various questions about about the future of the world order, about multipolarity, and so on. Now, if Russia invaded EU states, okay, that would be, that's still a kind of a far-fetched assumption at the moment. But again, it is something that there's worry about this in Europe. But of course, currently it's still the question of what happens with Ukraine. Then next on the agenda, if Russia decided to invade other states, would be presumably Moldova and maybe other Soviet states in Western Asia. But yeah, the Baltic states would be a likely target in the future, not least because there's also the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, so then you would have a land bridge to that and things like that. There is this concern, but obviously that would trigger a lot of other issues. So that the first question would be what happens with NATO? If Trump becomes president again, does NATO remain intact? If it remains intact, then those states are not just members of the EU, they're also members of NATO. Yeah. I think by now, I was going to say, yeah, not all EU member states are members of NATO, but most are now. And in fact, just recently, 2 more EU member states have joined NATO, Sweden and Finland, Sweden just a couple of days ago. There are still a few EU member states that are not members of NATO. You mentioned Austria. I don't think Austria would be an early target for a Russian attack, both geographically and for other reasons. But so if those states were attacked, states like the Baltic states, and NATO is still intact, that triggers Article 5. That would be a whole new dimension. And at that point, I think there could then be a major direct war between the collective West or the NATO states and Russia. There's a nuclear dimension. So I think at that point, the reaction of the rest of the world would probably be somewhat secondary. But also, of course, I think the rest of the world, has some questions to ask themselves. Like one of them I mentioned before, there's the president. If a powerful state goes on not just to invade another state without provocation, but just to take its territory, make it its own, that's new. And there's been very little reaction from the rest of the world. So what does it tell us about the future of international law? What does it tell us about the future of sovereignty? I think there's a lot of states in the global south for whom this would likely be a very important concern, I could imagine. So yeah, there's many different dimensions to this, I suppose. I think there was a second question there as well among the group, or?
Yes,
Please, Boris. We have 15 minutes more. We would end the session at 1:30. So
okay, I'll try to answer more quickly now.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Hassan. I'm a student of MPhil. My question is: you spoke about disunity among European states. You spoke about German intel assessment of the invasion and reluctance of the Nord Stream. In this chart, we saw that Germany is number 3 on the top economy. Recently, there was a call that was leaked. The call of a Luftwaffe general got leaked from the WebFX Singapore conference. And in the London circles particularly, we noticed that it was called as a deliberate act which leaked the information of possible invasion of these West countries to take back Crimea region. So in your assessment, what do you think? Was it, the national interest took over the regional interest there by Germany, and it was a deliberate leak of the call?
No, I mean the leak was done by Russia, of course. So Russia, okay. The story behind this is this: Germany was as I said, was initially quite reluctant to step up to Russia there, both before the invasion, even after the invasion. Germany was perceived by many as kind of an obstacle to fast aid. And it was, was very reluctant with every weapon system. It was about infantry fighting vehicles, and it was about main battle tanks, and it was about artillery pieces. Basically, it always seemed like Germany had to be pushed to do more. But that kind of changed over time. I mean, Germany has actually become one of the, in fact, after the US, I think Germany is the second biggest supplier of military aid, and also humanitarian aid to Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. And it has actually been relatively consistent in its support. Among the major parties in Germany, there's now quite a consensus on keeping up support for Ukraine, unlike in the US. In fact, in Germany, the only major party that is opposed is once again the far right, sort of far right anti-immigrant parties. Those tend to be the closest allies of Putin in Europe, same in Germany. So Germany actually at the moment is providing a lot of support, but there's recently been a particular debate about one type of support, and that's called a Taurus. It's basically, I think it's like a guided missile. It's
Yes.
called. Yeah, but anyways, it's a long-range guided missile, a cruise missile, which is a system Germany possesses, and the question was, should that be provided to Ukraine? And so far, much of the German political establishment is in favor. The chancellor, however, has opposed it. And this call was an internal secret call among generals of the German Air Force. And this was basically about, if this Taurus missile was provided to Ukraine, what would Ukraine do with it? Or what could Ukraine do with it? What targets could it attack? So it wasn't that Germany said these and these targets should be attacked. It was actually part of the discussion, should we provide it or not? And part of this would then be, would it actually help Ukraine? What would Ukraine do? But I mean, the concern is in Germany that Ukraine would do too much, because this is a very powerful system. It's a very long-range system. And the problem is, if you give this to Ukraine, would they then use it to attack targets within Russia, targets that Germany wouldn't want to have attacked? So that's the reason why so far the German chancellor has said no. So this is what this call was about. There were military experts, as in soldiers, high-ranking soldiers, who were discussing the scenarios if this is supplied to Ukraine. What would the Ukrainians, what could they do, and what would they likely do with these missiles? It was not that Germany was planning to invade Russia or that Germany was planning to get involved directly there. It was a planning scenario, a part of the discussion, whether to provide this missile system or not. And this was hacked by the Russians because one general was incredibly careless. He was at a conference in Singapore, and he just joined this highly secret call from basically, I think, like a hotel Wi-Fi, the same I'm using right now, where you think it makes it kind of, it's this kind of a facepalm moment. But anyway, that's how it is. And the Russians, of course, then used it immediately, and it was all over the media. But yeah, this was what that was. So it was part of this discussion, what weapon systems to provide and what are the possible scenarios. Because if you give a weapon system, of course, you have to think about what's going to happen. What can it be used for? What will it be used for? So that's what this call was about. And so far, Germany has not provided this. Now there's a discussion of some kind of weird ring exchange to give this to the UK so that the UK would officially provide it to Ukraine. Yeah, Germany has always been very reluctant, also because of the past. Obviously, Nazi Germany invaded Russia 80 years ago. So not just Russia, the Soviet Union, of which Ukraine was a part, that also invaded Ukraine and caused huge suffering there. But anyway, so it was this general discussion in which context this call happened. Yeah.
Waris, is there any other student from our graduate students who would want to ask a question?
No, Dr. Asif, thank you.
All right, so Professor Alex, I would want.
There is Sibghatullah Safari, whose hand is up.
Sure. Yep.
Maybe just last question.
Yeah, Sibghat, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for taking my question, and thank you for Dr. Rabi Akhtar. The question I had, it was about the neutrality of Ukrainian government. I think the point that it wasn't discussed in the discussion was that how can Ukraine as a country is still neutral between the West and Russia? We see that Putin in Tucker Carlson's interview highlighting that Russia is having close cultural, linguistic, and historical ties with Ukraine. But Ukraine is not willing to have good relations with Russia. So there is problem of government in Ukraine, I think. So how can a future Ukrainian government stay neutral, and how hard or why hard it is for it to stay neutral?
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, when it comes to this issue of neutrality, I mean, that, of course, is mentioned in various contexts. As I mentioned before, those who claim that this is all about geopolitics, about NATO expansion and so on, they would say, well, as long as Ukraine kind of commits to being neutral, then Russia would surely accept that it would kind of withdraw its troops and so on. As I said, I don't necessarily share this view. I personally think that a lot of it has to do that, with Putin thinking that Ukraine should be Russian, that it should either be directly part of Russia or it should be controlled by Russia indirectly, but it should definitely be kind of under Russia's direct or indirect control, not least because he thinks that historically Ukraine is not independent, that Ukraine shouldn't be independent, really, and that Ukrainians shouldn't, exist separately from Russia. So that's the first thing. Now, about neutrality, well, here's the thing. I've dealt with Ukraine for quite a long time. I'm not necessarily a Ukraine expert, but I've visited, I've studied it for quite a long time. First time I visited it was a long time when I was still in high school, even. So one thing that I think has been quite decisive about Ukraine has been that for a long time it was kind of torn between West and East, right? There were this part of Ukraine which has always been more pro-Russian, also because a lot of people are native Russian speakers, especially in the East and South. And there was a part of Ukraine that was always kind of more kind of seeing itself as more independent, that resented Russia. Also, if you look at what Russia did to Ukraine in the 19th century and early 20th century, there's a lot of bad things that a lot of Ukrainians resent. So there was, I think, traditionally a kind of division of people, half the country being kind of pulled towards the West and the other half towards the East. And this has very much influenced Ukrainian political dynamics for a very long time. What's interesting is Putin in 2014, what did he do in 2014? He annexed Crimea, and then the sort of uprising in the eastern Ukraine happened, almost certainly with Russian support and Russian guidance. And that means in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, which is also one of the most pro-Russian parts of Ukraine, most of those who were pro-Ukrainian fled to the Ukrainian side. And so in the end, what happened is that actually what Putin did in 2014, effectively, he cut the two most pro-Russian territories in Ukraine out of the state. Crimea, which was sort of 80% Russian-speaking or so, or 75% Russian-speaking, and very pro-Russian, and the Donbass, which is also majority Russian-speaking. Those were the most pro-Russian parts of Ukraine traditionally. In all elections, this was where the pro-Russian candidates did best. And suddenly, it was no longer part of Ukraine, technically. In elections in Ukraine, it no longer took part. So, Putin, I think, to some extent, shot himself in the foot by doing this, because he then created a very stable pro-Western political majority in Ukraine, because those territories that were not occupied by Russia or kind of somehow taken out of Ukraine, the vast majority of people there were now pro-Western. In fact, more so than before, because a lot of people resented what Putin did with Crimea and Donbass and the ongoing conflict there. And so the problem that then created was, traditionally, Ukraine was kind of neutral between West and East. But after 2014, what was left of Ukraine was very stable, kind of pro-Western and anti-Russian. There was still a lot of pro-Russians there, but they were clearly a minority. And so in any democratic election, the pro-Western forces were now going to win. And it was kind of Putin's own doing that very much created this situation in many ways. And so the issue was neutrality. The problem with neutrality is it's not so much the government. The government in Ukraine is elected by the people. It's a flawed democracy, but essentially they have relatively free elections. Zelensky was relatively freely elected, and so were others. And you would first and foremost have to convince the people in Ukraine that they should be equidistant from Russia and the West, when most people in Ukraine at the moment seem to be wanting to be closer to the EU, closer to NATO, closer to the West, and have very little to do with Russia. And, I've talked to a lot of Ukrainians. There's now about 1 million or so Ukrainian refugees in Germany. I've met some, I've talked to them, and, they have a very deep hatred of Russia now that wasn't there 10 years ago in the past, And again, so first and foremost, if you wanted to enforce some kind of neutral statement, the first status for Ukraine, the first thing you would have to do, you would have to find a way to convince the Ukrainians to accept that when it's not their democratic choice. And the second thing you would have to do is to convince Putin, because Putin talks about neutrality. And of course that interview with Tucker Carlson was mainly Putin just giving his view unopposed for 2 hours. That's his presentation. It's his spiel. It's his kind of presentation there. He talks about neutrality, but I don't think that as I said, I personally think, having studied this for a long time, having read countless speeches, having looked at the history and so on, and again, look at statements by other Russian politicians, I don't think they want a neutral Ukraine. I think they want a Russian Ukraine. And again, if Putin doesn't convince you, as I said before, read Medvedev, read some of the other senior officials, the statements they say, the statements they make, I think it's pretty clear. So I think there's a neutral Ukraine would be great in many ways, but as you can see, I think there's some very big obstacles in the way of that.
They want another Belarusia there.
Yeah, that's true also. Look at the developments in Belarus. The only reason Belarus, I think, is still an independent state on paper is because Lukashenko, who's been in power for almost 30 years there, wants to keep his power, because otherwise, it's already part of a union state officially, so it's kind of a bit weird. The Russians are already treating Belarus like a little bit like it's part of Russia, and I think they probably would have similar designs for Ukraine. But again, that's just my view.
Let's end this conversation with this question, and the question, it's the last, and we would end the conversation here. How do you think this conflict can end? Where we have seen, as you talked about, there is Western disunity. Germany has been reluctant in terms of, providing support to Ukraine. If we have to look at the end of this conflict, Russia has been open to discussing and have negotiations, even from the start of the operation. And Ukraine also is willing to discuss the terms where this conflict can end. So what is your opinion, how this conflict can end here?
Well, I think everything's possible. Really is. Everything from a complete Ukrainian defeat to also some theoretically also less likely complete Russian defeat. We saw what happened with the Wagner insurrection last year and things like that. Strange things can happen. Putin might just get a heart attack, and then there would be an internal political crisis in Russia and whatnot. All possible things are possible. But in terms of what's likely, in all likelihood, there would have to be some form of negotiation, of course. What shape they should take and what positions should be taken, I think is unclear. I'm very skeptical to what extent Russia really seriously wants to negotiate or just wants to kind of present itself. But that is something that can only be found out if there is negotiations. And and then of course we would have to see what the battlefield dynamics are, what's happening in the West, where the biggest danger to the West is currently from the inside, from itself in a way, especially in the US. And then only on that basis could we see what the next steps are likely going to be. Obviously, if Ukraine was forced to formally recognize Russia's annexations, that would have possibly wide-ranging implications. In a sense, Russia would only have a partial victory there, but once again, I think the rest of the world also would have to ask themselves, what does it mean for international law? What does it mean for sovereignty, for the status of smaller states vis-a-vis big states? But in the end, and of course, the problem is that while we speak about all this, other wars are breaking out. And of course, there's a terrible situation, terrible suffering in Gaza. And all that is now in many ways kind of linked to that, and the world's attention is also, of course, diverted in different directions. So, yeah, unfortunately, we're living in a more complex world. Hence, I think the efforts to have these discussions and to set up think tanks and other kind of places to discuss this are all the more important now.
Ma'am, I would hand it over to Dr. Rabia for her ending remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asif, for bringing Professor Duben to all of us. I think it's been really an enlightening session. Great learning experience, learning from your perspective. Pakistanis have a real stake in Russia, Ukraine, because our prime minister was in Russia on the eve, Putin decided to invade, and we have been caught in that spiral ever since, So there is much interest in Pakistan in following what is happening because, as you rightly said, it is the geopolitics of it, we cannot be removed from because of being in a larger region. And, we all wish any kind of wars that are happening around us to end. But like you said, it's a complex multipolar world that we live in. So thank you so much for sharing with us today's lecture, your insights, and giving us your time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Asif.
Professor,
thank you very much.
Alex,
It's a pleasure.
Everybody.
Professor Alex, it was an honor to have you. And once again, I felt like I was in your class as I have been there. And it was really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you made some time.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you everyone for your interest.
Yeah, Professor, have a good day. And we will be in touch, inshallah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Have a good time. And we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.